This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. On today's show, we're going to discuss migration, both international and interstate. On the first half of the show, we'll examine the current state of immigration to the United States, the economic impacts of immigration, and how immigration policy might be better reformed. Then, on the second half of the show, we'll explore how differences in economic freedom between metropolitan regions impact interstate migration and the resulting economic consequences. My first guest is Dr. Pia Orrenius. Dr. Orrenius is the Vice President and Senior Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. She's also the co-author of Beside the Golden Door, U.S. Immigration Reform in a New Era of Globalization. Pia, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with just kind of getting a handle on the stylized facts of where we are with immigration to the United States kind of quantitatively now. How many foreign-born people are living in the United States, and as kind of a portion of us, how does this compare to in the past?
So we are about 45 million foreign-born residents of the United States. And this is about between 13 and 14% of the population. And so it doesn't quite reach historic highs. So at its historic high, the share of foreign-born as a percent of the population was about 15.5%, and that was at the turn of the last century, so the early 1900s.
Right. And we've seen a lot over the last year in the news, too, about illegal immigration at the southern border and such. A significant chunk of that foreign-born population is here illegally. How big is that portion, and how has that been changing?
It's interesting because you're right. We do have a large illegal immigrant population in the United States, but it's been shrinking. So currently we think it's about 10 million, little over 10 million, but it's been as high as 12 million. So it's actually been falling since around 2007. It looks like the Great Recession really took a dent out of illegal immigrant inflows into the United States.
Presumably because economic opportunities for them weren't as great here after the Great Recession?
Absolutely. What's interesting about illegal immigration, it's very sensitive to the business cycle. So unlike other legal immigration where you have to actually wait for a visa, these guys can come, pretty readily, or at least in the past they could. So you can see that they really correlate very tightly with the business cycle. So with the Great Recession, when employment opportunities completely dried up, especially in sectors like construction, we saw a complete pause in the immigration flows from places like Mexico.
And actually, speaking of Mexico, because I know you study that too, economic growth and opportunity has been expanding there as well, hasn't it?
Well, that's true. So immigration really depends on conditions in the home country as well as conditions in the destination country. So it matters what's happening in the US, but let's not forget what's happening in the origin country. So in Mexico, things have gotten considerably better. In terms of the labor market, there's more formal sector employment, there's more steady, less volatile GDP growth, and wages are growing in real terms. Okay, they're growing slowly, I admit that, but they are increasing on average about 1% to 1.5% in real terms per year. And that did not used to be the case in Mexico. For many decades, there were severe crises, hyperinflation, a depreciating currency. And the fact that those factors are behind us now and they have a stable peso really helps and has improved opportunities for Mexicans.
That makes sense, because ultimately it's about opportunities that's driving a lot of immigrant desires. And we know that people come here to make themselves better off. That's, I don't think, controversial. But a lot of people worry that when immigrants come here, how does it impact the United States? So obviously our economy must get bigger if we're adding more workers, but what happens to the wealth of the native-born population as we get more immigrants?
So you're right. There is a net benefit of immigration to the United States, both in the theory and in the applied research bears that out. But as with other things, changes to the economy, it does create winners and losers. So some of the winners are, as you might imagine, employers. So people who hire immigrants are winners from more immigration. Consumers, as consumers, the things we consume that are made by immigrants become cheaper when there's more immigration. And then there's a number of other knock-on effects which are also important.
So someone at home, you mentioned some of the winners now, but someone at home is saying, but jobs. This is like the number one probably popular objection that people will have to immigrants, is that they're going to somehow steal our jobs. What is the economic research related to this?
Right. So So this is interesting. So I'll be the two-handed economist. The two-handed economist is going to say, in the short run, when the pie is fixed, the economic pie is fixed, yes, we do see a small negative effect on the wages and employment opportunities of similar natives and prior immigrants. So if you're a construction worker, for example, and you see a large influx of Mexican construction workers, if you will, that's not going to benefit you necessarily in the short run. In the long run, however, what we see is that the inflow of labor actually generates business investment, and as the capital stock grows, that labor demand is restored. So in the long run, we don't see these adverse effects on native workers.
So actually compare it to international trade then in goods and services. It's not about net effect on jobs, but changing the mix of jobs that our native-born people do?
Absolutely. We see there's really interesting research that's been done showing a number of ways in which the economy responds to immigration. So one is, for example, it slows the automation process. So if you take particular industries that are more subject to automation and the new technologies, you see when there's an influx of immigrants, the labor costs fall, and so they slow their adoption of technological new automation that they might otherwise have adopted. So that's interesting. You also see that natives become more educated in response, probably so they don't have to compete head to head with immigrants, especially low-skilled immigrants. You also see natives move into supervisory positions. For example, on a job site, you might have a native supervisor of a work group composed of immigrants, and there you see the language skill really matters. So one reason you don't see these large adverse effects on native workers that compete with immigrants, if you will, is because they speak the language, and typically these low-skilled immigrants do not.
I think actually in this market, that's an excellent example that you brought up, because in the last year we had a hailstorm here in Lubbock, so virtually everybody's getting a new roof. And I know when I did, the contractor I negotiated with was native born, but most of the workers didn't speak English and were up on the roof working, and that's exactly the type of thing that you're finding here.
That's what you're finding, yes. And as long as you have a growing economy, especially like we do in Texas, you're not going to see any ill effects of immigration on the labor market, just because our economy grows so fast and we have such a scarcity of workers. Really, if you look at the growth in the oil sector and construction and other sectors that employ a lot of these blue-collar workers, we don't see any ill effects. Rather, we see that immigration speeds up growth.
Now, getting away from the narrowly economic impact, but also interacting with public policy, then sometimes there's concerns about tax drains or the fiscal impact of immigrants. What's the kind of overall state of knowledge of how do immigrants impact tax revenues?
Yeah, so the fiscal impact of immigration is a trick. There's many ways to calculate this, and you can look at it in the short run and the long run, and it's complicated. I'm sure people have seen reports of that immigrants are a drain on the fiscal system, that they take up more in public services than they contribute in taxes. But the truth really is, it's a very similar situation as it is with natives. So if we look at U.S. natives born here, if you have low levels of education and low income, you're typically a net recipient of public funds. You're not going to contribute as much in taxes as you use up in public funds just because you have a low income. And it's the same for immigrants. So immigrants that have low levels of education are also going to use more in public services than they contribute in taxes. And so there really isn't much difference there.
And in the longer run?
Well, in the longer run, it's very interesting. In the longer run, you get, when you take into effect the descendants of the immigrants, and so as long as the children of immigrants are assimilating, which the research suggests that they do on average assimilate and reach average educational attainment, that means that they do end up covering for the costs of the first generation.
All right, so in the last few minutes that we have to discuss, thinking about reforming legal immigration policy, I know in your book on immigration, you've discussed having a visa market. Describe what type of reform that would be.
Oh yeah, we have, so our idea so we have this problem here in the United States where we give out visas. So this is talking about employment-based visas. We do it first come, first serve. And we never really know, so if you're first in line, you get the visa. But of course, the economic argument is the most valuable person should get the visa. Valuable, and how do you measure value? Well, the way we propose doing it is actually having employers put a price on a permit to bring in that worker. And so we would run these auctions where employers bid on permits to bring in workers. And the benefit of the auction is you get the most valuable workers, if you will, as determined by employers. And then you also you get the most value, and then you're also generating revenue for the state. And so it's almost like a tax on immigration. And so it works both ways. It discourages immigration, but it also provides those companies that can afford to pay with immigrant workers.
It doesn't have to on net discourage immigration, though, depending what we do to quantity in response to this, right? If we increase the number of these visas and then had an auction market, that might be different than our status quo.
Yes. So, right. And so the other benefit of the auction system is you can see, if you run these auctions quarterly or even semi-annually, you can see in real time the demand for labor. So you can see as the demand for labor shifts, because the price of the permits will go higher. Then you can push more permits into the market and auction off more permits because you're seeing demand for labor has been increasing. And that's how you can sort of get to a more optimal level where you're matching the inflow with demand.
And of course, this would help address any of those fiscal concerns about tax drains from immigration as well. Here's a twist for you, though. Why just employers? Why not let anybody bid on these? So if you have a distant cousin in your home country, well, if you're willing to pay more than an employer to buy them the visa, why not let them in the market?
Yes, we considered that, and we discussed that in our book because, sure, others have proposed that idea. Gary Becker, the Nobel Prize laureate, of course, discussed that idea, and he thought that would be the free market solution to how to bring in immigrants and let people bid. But what we really remember that immigration has to be in the national interest. We took that premise. It has to be in the national interest. So if you do it that way, it's going to be in the immigrants' interest. And so we didn't see that there was necessarily going to be a one-to-one correlation there between the immigrants' interest and the national interest. So we thought that using employers, and we know that employment-based immigration has a number of benefits, even for natives and for the U.S. economy. So we thought that was the best way to go.
All right. I'm not necessarily convinced, but I
can understand.
It's certainly a step in the right direction. I really thank you for sharing these insights with us here today. Up next, how do differences in economic freedoms of our cities impact migration flows? Stick around to find out.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeVitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Founded in 2013, the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University promotes the teaching and study of free market economics. As part of our programming, we sponsor a public lecture series open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public in the Lubbock community. Often, the speakers in that series are the guests that you see right here on Free to Exchange. More information is available at www.fmi.ttu.edu or by email at free.market@ttu.edu. Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Dean Stansel. Dr. Stansel is a research associate professor at the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom at Southern Methodist University. He's also the author of the U.S. Metropolitan Area Economic Freedom Index. Dean, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ben.
So, tell me just briefly at the beginning here, if we are thinking about metropolitan area economic freedoms, how do you go about measuring that? What does it mean to be a free metro area versus unfree?
Sure. So
less free, I guess.
People use the phrase standing on the shoulders of giants. So this goes back 30 years ago to when Milton Friedman and our director at the O'Neill Center, Bob Lawson, was a grad student, decided wouldn't it be nice if we could measure the freedom of different countries across the globe and figure out how to compare them to each other for economic outcomes. A couple of years later, they said we could do this at states because it varies within states, or they call them provinces up in Canada. And so about probably 8 years ago, I said, you could drill down even farther to the local area because it varies within states as well. So the way that I measure it is a kind of a replication of what they do at the states level for economic freedom of North America. Economic freedom of the world here is the first product. These are all available, by the way, at freetheworld.com for your viewers if you want to go check them out for yourself. We have three broad areas. We've got spending, basically three slices of the pie. Taxes, same thing, three slices of the pie. And for each of those, To compare across states, we divide by income. So, for example, a $5,000 tax bill in Mississippi is going to be a lot more burdensome than in New York because incomes are so much lower. So we divide by income to adjust for that. The third category is labor market restrictions. We look at things like the minimum wage. So you take the minimum wage and you say 52 or 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. Here's what you earn. What is that? How does that compare to income in that state, or in this case, in that metro area, to see how binding that,
All right,
that
so we're
price
looking
floor
at
is.
taxation, how big government is basically by
Yes.
government spending,
That's right.
both at the state and local level all together, and then
Yes.
the labor markets.
That's
So how does it stack up? What are the more free metro areas in the country? What are the less free ones?
Okay, so you're going to be surprised to hear that 8 of the top 10 of the biggest ones, of the ones with $1 million and over, are Florida and Texas.
All right.
Yeah, so Houston's number 1, followed by Jacksonville, Tampa, Richmond, Virginia, Dallas-Fort Worth, and then at the bottom, shocking, New York and California and Ohio make up 8 of the bottom 10. That includes Riverside's at the very bottom, Rochester, Buffalo, New York, Cleveland. It's kind of the usual suspects in these kind of lists.
Yeah. Well, since we're in Texas, let's break it down a little bit more here then. Is there, if Houston is near the top, well, actually, where does Lubbock fall? And are there any dogs in Texas, people who aren't living up to what the rest of the state does because they're metro areas?
Yes, there are. So Texas as a whole is above most other areas in other states, but Lubbock, out of the 330 smaller metro areas, ranks 57th. So you say that's pretty good. There's 25 metro areas in Texas. Lubbock ranks only 20th. And your neighbor up there, Amarillo, ranks 9th out of the 25. So there's some work to be done, but it's, nationally, they're doing quite well.
Yeah, let's get that tax burden down here in Lubbock. Huh?
There you go.
So when in the first half of the show, we talked about international migration a lot, but of course there's lots of migration within the 50 states and between these metro areas.
Right.
How, we think of the United States kind of as a land of the free, as a beacon that immigrants want to come here because we're free. Do we see similar relationships at the metro level?
Absolutely. There have been probably 600 different articles looking at the country level data, about 250 looking at the state level data. And a portion of that, of course, looks at migration, looks at the basic idea behind it is that if people and businesses actually prefer to have higher levels of economic freedom in their choice of where they live, then you're going to see this positive relationship between freedom scores and in migration. And the country level literature supports that. Excuse me. The state level does too. At the local level, it's a newer index. There's really not a lot done there, but I have a paper in the works right now. Our preliminary results show, kind of confirming what states and nations show, that people vote with their feet and choose these areas that have higher scores on economic freedom.
All right, so I know this is just kind of conjecture, but is this people choosing to move to a free place just because they want to be a little bit more free in the metro, or is this kind of driven by jobs and businesses locating where taxes are lower, government's less burdensome, and that creates job growth, and then the people flow to the jobs?
Right, yeah, it's really a little bit of both. And in fact, people move for a wide variety of reasons. Most people don't move just for public policy disputes, but there's some of that. And if you're a small business person in particular...
I escaped Massachusetts to move to Texas.
Well, there's an excellent example, all right. But if you're a small business that in an industry where you could be anywhere, and you're out in California and you've got all this regulation, all this bureaucracy, all these high tax burdens, well, sometimes those bad policies do play a pretty big role in driving you out. We've got tons of evidence of businesses moving from California to Texas. So there's a lot of that going on, which I guess would be the push, as you pointed out. But the pull, where they decide to go to, right? It's determined a lot by. They could go to Oregon, but a lot of them, Oregon's not terribly free, and a lot of them are instead coming to Texas and Nevada and Arizona, places like that.
So actually, and this is big because in the international migration literature, you think of things like push, where it's a refugee crisis somewhere, right, and they're all running from a war zone. That's obviously not true in here, but it's the California taxation war that's a push maybe. Is there a relative importance to push versus pull, do you think, or just a combination?
I think it's maybe the push is the biggest factor. Every year, these moving companies release their data on how many people move from this state and that state, and the map always matches up nicely with the state level map of the areas where people are fleeing and they're moving trucks are the ones with low freedom, and the areas they're going to are areas with high freedom. In fact, there was something I saw recently about the price. Like renting a U-Haul from Phoenix to San Francisco was like a lot more a lot cheaper than moving from San Francisco to Phoenix because there's demand, right? A lot of people are fleeing California, but to get from Arizona to Phoenix, you have to pay a much higher price to get that truck because they just aren't available.
Right, you almost wants you to pay to bring the truck back to them so they can get another California.
It's like an entry tax almost.
So what does this mean for a metropolitan area then? If they're more free and people are flowing in, what does this do to the economy there? How big is this effect? Give us a magnitude.
So one of the things we found in our latest report that came out, with the Reason Foundation, is that we broke the groups and the metros into 4 groups: most free, second most free, et cetera, quartiles as we often call them. Most free quartile had population growth 4 times bigger than the least free group. Income was about 11% higher in the most free group compared to the least free group. And so, in fact, one of your colleagues, Professor Jamie Pavlik, did a study on this a couple of years back, looking at income growth, looking at entrepreneurial activity, and found similar types of results where those areas with higher freedom get these much better outcomes.
So this leads to another question then. So if the higher freedom metros produce higher incomes, better job growth, and all of this stuff, and people are fleeing high tax New York and California, when they come there, they have immediate voting rights and political participation. I mean, you live here in Texas with me. The fear is all these Californians come to Texas and they're going to turn Texas into something that's not Texas. Do you find evidence of this as you look at how freedom changes with these migration flows between states?
Right. No, that's a great question. And I know you've done some research on this at the international level. I've got some research and work at the state level. I haven't done anything local yet. But ultimately, the fears of this Californication, as they call it sometimes, are overwrought. There's no consistent findings of any sort of relationship between percentage of population that's from somewhere else and your policy outcomes with these economic freedom indices. So there's really no story there. In fact, in the last election, so I saw some poll results for the big Senate election in Texas, and the folks who have lived in Texas just a few years, who have moved here recently, voted in a substantial margin for Cruz, not for Beto. And I'm not endorsing either one of these guys, but ultimately that kind of defies this fear of Californication, that you're going to get all these liberal policies that California has. And I think the reason is pretty simple, and it applies to your international work as well, is that if you're fleeing this area that has all these horrible policies, why on earth would you then vote for those horrible policies you just left in your new place? And I think the fears are overwrought, and people are more sensible than we think.
Yeah, it's a big selection bias of who chooses to move to the more free area. I've got to imagine that I'm a bigger fan of economic freedoms than most people in Texas. So I hope I didn't bring my Massachusetts with me in that regard.
Exactly, yeah, you're a good example of that. Yeah.
Now, in the first half of the show, we talked about international migration. So with all of the debates that have gone on over the past year about border wall and immigrants and stuff, and it breaks down Democrats and Republicans, and some people say, well, the Democrats want more international migrants in because they're going to vote Democrat. Democrat Republican's not a good proxy for freedom, admittedly. But so let's talk about what matters then, the freedom. How about, instead of just interstate migration, are you able to look at rates of immigrants from foreign countries and how that affects different metro areas and their economic freedom?
Good point. Yeah. So there's been some work done on that. We have a paper in progress where we are indeed looking at the percentage of your population that was born in another country, and we're getting the same kind of results that people get for the state level stuff. That really it tends to not matter. And I think part of it is that the people who have the incentive to actually move, it's difficult to move. You moved to Texas a few years ago. I moved to Texas a few years ago, especially when you have a family. It creates all sorts of stress and all sorts of problems. And so the people who actually do it must really want to be in that new place. And therefore, they're attracted by what that new place offers, not by what the place they left has.
Yeah, so actually, in just last few seconds then, to keep relating this to the international migration that we talked about, you find the evidence of people moving to the more free metro areas within the United States. When we look internationally, I know this isn't your index now, but do we also find a similar effect of international immigrants moving to the lands of the relatively free?
Oh, right. Yes, exactly. So I'm not as familiar with it, but there's some literature on that shows the same basic finding, that these economic freedom areas, these high economic freedom areas, tend to act like magnets and pull people away from the lower freedom areas.
Presumably more people who are seeking freedom.
Right, exactly. I mean, who doesn't like freedom? What's not to like?
Unfortunately, we could have a long list among our politicians.
That's the next show.
But thank you very much for joining me today,
Thanks
Dean.
for having me, Ben.
America, land of the free, at least relatively speaking. We have greater economic freedoms in our country than a lot of immigrants do in the countries they originate from. And with that greater economic freedom comes greater economic opportunities. And that's what attracts them here. On today's show, we also saw that we had differences in economic freedom between U.S. cities that attract migrants from one state or city to another within the United States. When migrants move, either domestically or internationally, it's because they expect to benefit. That's obvious. But what we also learned today is that when they move, they enhance the economies of the regions where they relocate to, and that this makes the existing citizens of that area a little bit wealthier. I think this means that rather than discouraging migration, we should be thinking about policies that would encourage legal migration. On the domestic level, I think this means things like abolishing occupational licensing laws that make it hard for a skilled professional in one city to move to another city. On the international level, I think this means rather than building walls, we should instead control illegal migration by creating greater legal avenues to migrate here and better allocating those permits. My first guest on the show today had a creative idea of how you might do that with auction markets. I certainly think that might be a step in the right direction. We'll see you next time.